I never thought about this. He doesn't live in Pee-wee's Playhouse.
No, he leaves.
Yeah.
It was actually like, I hadn't thought about it either when I was a kid watching the show.
1980s Now.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of 1980s Now, a weekly examination of the importance of 1980s pop culture and its continued influence today. My name is Will, and joining me in just a few minutes will be our special guest, Professor and author Cait McKinney. We're going to be chatting about Cait's book, which just makes a great case for the idea that, 80s, the long, lasting effects of 80s pop culture. But Cait's book is I Know You Are, But What Am I on Pee-wee Herman. It's available now. You can get it anywhere. We recommend bookshop.org, of course. Now, I'm going to give you some behind-the-scenes info real quick here. I was set to publish this episode, which, of course, is about, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in just a moment, but it's about Pee-wee Herman and Pee-wee's Playhouse and the late actor Paul Reubens, the comedian who embodied the character. When some late-breaking news, just moments before scheduling this for publication, came out about the actor. And I'm going to tell you about that in just a moment. And then I could read you more from the article after we chat with Cait. But it's important because I chatted with Cait before this news broke, and it's relative to our conversation. I think you'll see why. But about Cait's book, hey, so the tagline for our show, right, is about the continued influence of 80s pop culture. And to be quite honest, usually when I think about it and I say it, I'm talking about, how things that happened in the 1980s with regard to media still continue to influence our movies, our television shows, our music, and so on and so forth. What is, I think, implicit in it, or actually comes out in our show if you listen to it on a regular basis, is the impact that the pop culture had on us. Right? Now that's, I feel like I'm not saying anything that you don't know, except maybe just saying it out loud. This idea that things that we experience, in particular in our youth, continue to influence us today. And I bet, just as an exercise, if you think about a song or a movie or a character from that era that continues to inspire you, move you, maybe influence the way you perceive the world, I bet you can. Even if it's just a song that, helps get you pumped up, on a daily basis, maybe when you're feeling down. For me, there's a number of characters like that. I relied a lot on pop culture to find strength when I otherwise felt powerless as a kid. The Greatest American Hero and the Hulk, for example, were characters that I felt like, made me believe that there was somebody inside of me, or that even that fact that I was just a normal kid, that I still had the possibility to be something greater, to have superpowers, to be able to, affect the world, to defend myself, felt important when I was younger. And in a different way, a somewhat different way, I suppose, was the character of Pee-wee Herman. Now, I first saw Pee-wee Herman on the HBO special that he did with his Groundlings co-stars. It began as a character he developed as a member of the Groundlings, and then ultimately he has this live stage show, and HBO films it and puts it out there. And I thought it was fantastic. Not only was it funny, but it was moving, particularly the ending when the boy could fly. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. But it was later in the 1980s, as I was an older person, I was a teenager by then, when the movies came out and then the TV show ultimately came out, Pee-wee's Playhouse, that the character hit me differently. And it made me feel, and I'll be honest here, I don't know that I could articulate this then, except that I did certain things that imitated him. But that character, embodied by, again, this adult man, gave me the freedom to be myself, I felt, because he could be ridiculous and not feel embarrassed about it. And certainly he was loved among the characters in the Playhouse. And for earlier in my life, having struggled with feeling, overly sensitive about how people perceived me, later in the 1980s, certainly, with the help of Pee-wee Herman, I felt more empowered to not give a damn, really, and just be who I was. I wasn't the epitome of masculinity, as, were represented by many of the 1980s icons we had at the time. No, I was closer, in the spectrum of that toward Pee-wee Herman, really, being ridiculous and, somewhat effeminate at times, but also masculine. This, weird balance of things that, other pop culture was not allowing us, was providing these images that, we were expected, to be, that I didn't line up with. I couldn't stand lifting weights back then. I lift now. Come at me, bro. But back then, Pee-wee Herman, that character, again, just made me feel free to be myself. Now, what I didn't know, and I couldn't have known, even though I'm an empathetic person, what I didn't understand or know at the time, and only know now with the benefit of Cait's book, is how impactful, how important, how similarly, but on a greater level, meaningful was the show and the character for members of the queer community. Obviously, folks in the queer community back in the 80s, and unfortunately today, are treated similarly, are treated like they don't, not by everyone, of course, thank goodness, but there's still pockets of communities that see them as the other, right? Which is ridiculous. Don't make me swear before we bring out Cait. Is ridiculous. But thank goodness for shows like this, because as we'll learn, we chat with Cait, they too gave this community, the feeling that they could exist in their true selves. And we'll get into it with Cait. And it turns out there's reasons why the show was that way. And it's really cool and fascinating in it. And the book itself goes into way more than that, talking about how the technology was on the show, talking about the impact of Paul Reubens' arrest in the early 1990s. Really fascinating. Well done. Seriously, get it on bookshop.org. There's a link in the comments below. But I teased a moment ago. There's news about Paul Reubens, and it's relative to our conversation and the thing I've just mentioned. And I'll read you a paragraph from it right now, and then we'll chat with Cait. If you want to hear more about this, I'll after the interview, I'll come back to it. But this is from People magazine, published on January 24th. Pee-wee Herman star Paul Reubens comes out as gay in posthumous documentary. So Paul Reubens, as we'll chat with Cait, because we chatted before this news broke, lived his life in secret, his personal life, certainly. He played a number of different characters in addition to Pee-wee Herman, but Pee-wee Herman was predominantly the character he played. But that was the best we got to know this guy, really, because he very rarely appeared as himself, and certainly he didn't share, about his personal life. But as People magazine writes here, in a posthumous documentary, Pee-wee as Himself, which premiered Thursday, January 23rd at the Sundance Film Festival, the legendary comedian came out as gay after concealing his sexuality for the entirety of his career. I wanted you to know that before we chat. And again, it shouldn't affect what we're talking about here, but I think it's interesting. Well, I should say, I think it's sad, actually, because of how impactful and important the work was to members of the queer community about feeling like they can be themselves when the actor himself was concerned about behaving like his true self in public. God, that just breaks my heart. Aside from the fact that, I just love this character and loved the guy. When I knew or saw of him, he seemed like a wonderful guy. All right, let's listen to my chat with Cait.
Prior to this point in time, somewhere in the past, the timeline skewed into this tangent, creating an alternate 1985. Alternate to you, alternate me, but reality for everyone else.
Our guest today is an associate professor at the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University and the author of I Know You Are, But What Am I? An exploration of the cultural legacy of Pee-wee Herman and his beloved cult television show. In it, our guest examines how the, quote, children's show foretells and perhaps prepares us for some of our current societal challenges. Our guest also looks at how queer people who were children in the 1980s remember and relate to Pee-wee now. The book is available everywhere. Please get your copy on bookshop.org because they help mom and pop bookstores all around the country, and your shopping experience is the same as any of those bigger websites. There's a link in the episode notes. Please welcome to the show, Cait McKinney. Hey, Cait.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you. And look, I'll be quite frank with you for lots of reasons, including that I'm a huge Pee-wee Herman fan. I have been. I want to say I was one of those kids look, I grew up in the 80s. I was born in the 70s, grew up in the 80s. So I was one of those kids whose parents let them watch whatever they wanted to, basically. So I watched the HBO special that Paul Reubens had when Pee-wee was more adult. Uh-huh. Not more. It was an adult show. And it all went over my head except for the stuff that, was intended for me. And I loved it. So when the films came out and the TV show, for me, it was like, oh, other folks are finding out about this weird guy that I already like.
Good. I'm glad to be talking to a fan. Yeah, I mean, I grew up watching it too, obviously, because I wrote a book about it. I mean, I was born in 1983, so to me, I was like, the age of I was a 6-year-old when I was watching this for the first time. So very much like did not get any of the jokes for adults.
Right. You describe how important Pee-wee Herman as a character, and Paul Reubens for that matter, was to the queer community, to queer kids growing up, and also how the show itself was queer coded. I think I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
I guess just so everybody listening knows what we're talking about. What does it mean for something to be coded in that way?
Yeah. I mean, I think, first off, it's important to just note that like all kinds of people were fans of Pee-wee Herman.
Right.
Like this was a mainstream hit, this show. You didn't have to be queer to like it or to love it or even to get it. But by queer coded, I mean that there were all kinds of jokes, innuendo, cultural and visual references in the show that were meant to bring in queer viewership and sort of insider queer perspective on the world. And that was very deliberate. Like the writing staff and the art direction team of the show have given many interviews in the decades since the show ended about how important that was to them. To sort of bring a kind of gay or queer world to screen. And adult fans of the show in the 1980s knew that, right? Knew that that's what they were watching, that they were watching this kind of cult queer text, even though it also had mainstream appeal. And I think what's really important to note about any kind of cultural text being queer coded is that it doesn't just mean that queer folks come to it and love it, but also that they feel seen by it and feel a kind of element of recognition and sometimes even safety in the fan cultures that pop up around those kinds of cultural texts.
So, you talk about how the writers, the creators, the people behind the scenes wanted to do this. I would love to be able to say how things are so much different now. I think you agree with me. It's just, we're going backwards here, culturally speaking, socially speaking. But it seems like in the 1980s, I guess it would be easy to say that in the 1980s, it probably was, we were less progressive as a country than we are now. We've got challenges still ahead, unfortunately. But I think I could fairly see in the 80s, look, we had the AIDS epidemic. There was more homophobia as a result. So folks weren't as out and it wasn't as safe at the time. So why would a group of folks want to do that, I guess, or motivated to do that at the time?
Yeah, I mean, your whole show is about the 1980s, right? And like, it's fun to go back to the 1980s and think about the amazing pop culture that came out of that time period. But another important part of going back to the 1980s is to think about what the political moment was in which that pop culture we love was able to emerge, right? And the political context for Pee-wee's Playhouse to be able to emerge in the way it did was very much two things. First being the AIDS crisis, right? Like this was a period of time where gay men in particular, and men who have sex with men, were being abandoned by the state, who wasn't recognizing this illness that was decimating populations of queer people, of brown and black people, of people who use drugs. And there was a real anger and rage and also grief and mourning that came out of that. So for this show, Pee-wee's Playhouse, to be queer coded in this way and to celebrate queer culture was really meaningful within that context of feeling like really not seen and really abandoned and left to die. And then the other political context in the 1980s that's important for Pee-wee's Playhouse is the way that the 1980s approached masculinity, right? So this is like a period of Reaganism. There's like the celebration of like rugged, autonomous masculinity. Think of like the Marlboro Man. Think of like Reagan as this kind of cowboy figure. This idea of like returning to the 1950s and like white suburban life and really rigid gender roles. These were all sort of big politicized cultural ideas in the 1980s that Pee-wee's Playhouse was really critiquing and responding to by putting forward this really other vision of what it could look like to be part of a family, to be in a domestic space, and to do masculinity really differently, because he was such a sissy in this completely unapologetic and wonderful and like wild and playful way.
Wow. I never, look, at the time I watched it and I was older than you were, obviously, when I first saw it, but none of this occurred to me. But what did occur to me was I identified it with him in a way that I think I'm not gay, But some of the ways you talk about queerness in the show and the queer coding are things that I responded to. This idea of the other, this idea of the outsider. I didn't identify with any of those masculine, stereotypes that you're I was always a person who felt like motivated to just, or I wanted to be able to be myself. And he was a character who I felt like he gave me permission to be more ridiculous and whatever that wound up being.
Yeah. And to like be a masculine person in whatever way felt authentic and true to you. Right. Cause like, that's what gender on Pee-wee's Playhouse was like. It wasn't like this rigid system that you had to bend your desires and your sense of self to fit into. It was like a form of play in a way that you could express yourself. And like most children's media, children's toys, children's popular culture in the 80s was like so organized around a gender binary, right? Like I grew up, another show that, two shows that I really liked were like He-Man and She-Ra. Mm-hmm. Right. Which were very popular came out not in the 80s, but were very popular in the 1980s. And it was like boys watched He-Man and girls watched She-Ra. And of course, like people, watched both of those shows, but it was like thought of as transgressive, right, or like you were doing the wrong thing if you liked the kind of media that wasn't for your gender. And Pee-wee's Playhouse was like really not trying to not be a show for boys or a show for girls. It was a show for kids. And that really opened up a kind of liberating space for, like you said, all kinds of viewers, not just queer viewers who felt really alienated from masculinity or femininity as it was, promoted and practiced in a more like mainstream and dominant way.
I'm sure the word's not irony, but I'm sure it's not lost on you that so much of what you're describing about the 80s seems applicable today. This idea that where, folks they're longing for the 1950s and longing for two lanes of, gender roles. And it's disappointing to me. I can't imagine. I imagine it's even more disappointing to you having, sort of studied things like this and maybe the short-term impact of folks like Pee-wee that only were getting sort of dragged back.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have this idea that as we move forward in time, our cultures become more progressive and more accepting of gender difference and sexual difference. And in some ways that's true. Right? Like at the very least, we're living in a time right now where there's a lot more visibility, for example, of transgender folks in our current moment. But that heightened visibility has also come along with this huge right-wing backlash that is really trying to limit the gender expression of kids and young people, for example, in ways that were really similar to how the 1980s was quite rigid and organized around gender roles. So, when I was writing this book and thinking about Pee-wee Herman in the 1980s, I was really struck by a lot of the similarities and resonances between how gender worked in the 1980s and how it is operating right now. Because we're living in, I think, a really scary time around, the ability of especially queer and trans kids to be able to live safely, go to school in dignity, and have their basic rights respected.
I know we're here to talk about your book, but I just got to say, it just pisses me off to no end. Why can't people just mind their own damn business? That has nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
And it seems like the same folks who will complain about a neighbor's ball going into the yard don't understand that these attitudes they have are a similar idea. You're encroaching on someone else's rights. We're not asking you to do more we're just asking you to stay within the bounds of your rights.
Yeah.
So, hey, let's talk about some specifics about the show, which I thought was interesting how you thought about these, including the fact that when we're, hearkening back to the 1950s and also the fact that the show came out in the 1980s, an era which, technology was booming, for example. And I argue oftentimes, only somewhat tongue-in-cheek, I'd like to finish doing the research to prove this, but that it was maybe more, this is going to sound ridiculous saying to an academic, but that 10 years of growth in the 1980s, where maybe we had, so whatever, I'm not even going to say that to you. You're too smart for that. You'll just shoot me down.
No, say it.
I was going to say that it's, I want to say it was more of a renaissance than, the medieval renaissance in a sense. That one took a long time and was spread across countries. But in 10 years, you saw all these evolutions, including technological. And you have this show that is a throwback to the 1950s when we had this sort of atomic age, sort of, they had fun with the predictions of the 80s would be. And in the 80s, we had, some other technology that was trying to be the precursor to things we have today. And in the middle of this silly kids show, you have some things that are, prescient. But they're more they're kind of along the lines of, they're also subversive in a sense that you were sort of talking about earlier, I think.
Yeah. I mean, the 80s was the rise of like two new technologies that were really important in changing our culture. So the first was the personal computer, right? So the idea for the first time that computers became miniaturized. And they could be single machines that regular people had in their workplace or in their home. So this is the beginning of this like computing revolution. And the second thing that's new is computer networks, right? So the computer networks that became the precursor to the internet in the 1990s, those start in the 1980s. And I'm talking about like bulletin board systems.
Right.
And so there's this ability for people, mostly nerds, to be
I was on them.
Yeah, to be able to communicate about niche topics with people who like you didn't know, right? Like stuff you were, a fan of, with people you didn't know in real life who were spread far away from you geographically. And so the world, through these advances in computing, the world starts to get smaller in a way, and our everyday communication practices and even processes in our household become computerized really, really quickly. So think, for example, of like for the first time, you'd be able to program your VCR in the 1980s because it has a tiny computer in it. You can tell it when you want to record a show. It seems like a small thing now, but these are big changes. Computing is becoming like more embedded just in the everyday lives of regular people. And all that is to say that Pee-wee's Playhouse is taking shape during this cultural moment of really rapid technological transformation that, like you pointed out, Will, is similar in a lot of ways to the 1950s, where there's this post-war kind of Cold War obsession with the space race and nuclear technology, and the idea that investment in that kind of technological progress is what's going to ensure the safety and also superiority of the U.S. state, right? So what Pee-wee's Playhouse does with this moment of really rapid computerization in the 1980s is like they make it weird, right? So Pee-wee has all kinds of technologies in the Playhouse that we might think of as being computers or being like computers. There's Conky, his sort of robot that is basically in what we'd call today an artificial intelligence or AI that spits out the word of the day each day. And everyone in the Playhouse, when that word is said, screams together, and kids at home watching are supposed to scream too. There's Globy, who's the globe with a humanoid face on wheels, who has arms, and he kind of rolls around the Playhouse and helps Pee-wee with different kind of tasks related to information and geography. There's Magic Screen, who's basically like a talking iPad that Pee-wee can jump in and out of and do basic kind of computing processes. And these are moments in the show of computer animation that seemed really advanced and were quite expensive to produce in the 1980s. And all these kinds of devices are ways of Pee-wee like playing with these technologies that didn't exist in real life, but that people were kind of able to imagine for the first time as like on the horizon, whereas things that we might have soon. And indeed, they all like look very much like technologies that we do have today in the early 21st century, like iPads, like AI that we can talk to. So the show, like, I think modeled for us a different vision of what computing technologies could become if they were wacky, they didn't make sense, and they didn't have to make money for corporations.
Right. Yeah. And it's the make money for corporations part, right? That makes it that how it differs from what we actually got. Because you're right. These things are analogous to stuff we have today, but they're not mining data. They're not, that's, feeding advertisements based on whatever Pee-wee did that day.
Yeah, they were just joyful. They were just for fun. No one was trying to extract information about our bodies and our lives to feed an algorithm, right? It was about Pee-wee being in these really mutually affirming relationships with these technologies in his house that also had names and personalities. So really different model of like what it can look like to live with computers.
And it seems like, if we think again about this idea that the creatives behind the show were, some of them were queer people, and they together, regardless, they conspired to, put certain themes in the show that, whether queer coded or not, quite honestly, they were just, and maybe that's the idea of folks, that felt like on the outside, trying to create an environment that's welcoming to anybody and certainly safe for the person, that they all, the center there, the Pee-wee, that they wound up creating a world that's, wonderful for anybody. I guess if it's safe for queer people, it's safe for anybody because, what was my point going to be? My point was going to be that along those lines, that the human folks too, in a similar way, right, as the technology, are welcoming, inviting. They're diverse. They're non-judgmental. They accept Pee-wee, this man boy, for what he is. There's no even discussion about how that's odd.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that, the human the characters?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what we've been talking about is like the queer coding of this space is that it's a space that welcomes and celebrates people like as they are and doesn't try to force them to become or be something else. And that is like a way that the show celebrated outsiders and weirdos and nerds and eccentric people. And I think part of the reason it gets this like cult status moving out of the 1980s and into the 1990s, and even in the present, I would argue it still has a cult status, yes, is like because it provided so many people who have never completely fit in with this like text they could identify with. And let's be honest, that's a lot of who makes up like nerdy fan cultures, is people who haven't felt kind of held and seen by the mainstream. Right. And that took place on this show as not just a politics about gender, which we've already talked about, but also a politics about race. Right. So this was a show in the 1980s that had a broad cast that included many people of color as actors and characters on the show, where they got to just be that character and have a kind of full life and experience that wasn't solely defined by their race. Right. And that was like a very unusual thing in the 1980s on television. It's less unusual now, but unfortunately still kind of unusual. But this was a like thing that Pee-wee's Playhouse was doing that other television shows, children's television shows, weren't doing, with the exception of, I would say, Sesame Street was another example, right? And so the show really like created a space where difference could be unremarkable, and where people were able to like arrive at the Playhouse and show up as themselves and really like get to play.
I think it's interesting you pointed out that in the credits, they only mention the non-human characters, and they don't celebrate or acknowledge. And maybe it's just a function of the fact that they don't know what special guest was going to be on that weekend to create. But Pee-wee Herman himself does not get a name name placard or whatever you call it, a chyron with his name on it. Right?
Yeah. One of so basically the opening like theme song of the show, it names all of the main like puppet characters in the show, but it doesn't, as you said, list any of the human actors and their characters. And that in one of the interviews I read with some of the creative team behind the show was a deliberate decision and a request that Paul Reubens made about the opening of the show. Was like he wanted to center these non-human characters and their world. And like importantly, Pee-wee's Playhouse exists in a world that we are told is called Puppet Land. So it tells you like who comes to matter, who's important in this world, in this like environment, is like the puppets are centered, right? And the humans we get to be along for the ride, but we're not who's driving the action or determining the story.
Yeah. And as you point out, he doesn't live there. I never thought about this. He doesn't live in Pee-wee's Playhouse.
No, he leaves. Yeah. It was actually like, I hadn't thought about it either when I was a kid watching the show. It just wasn't, I don't know. I didn't make anything of it, but like going back to work on this book, which I like started working on in like deep COVID lockdown. And I think a lot of people watched Pee-wee's Playhouse again during that time because it was on Netflix briefly, and also like a lot of us just had a lot of time on our hands to binge watch television, old television. I was like, oh man, he is, even in the first season, he arrives at the house at the beginning of some of the episodes, and at the end of every episode through every season of the show, he leaves on his like scooter. So it's interesting to, what I do with that in the book is think of it as like, what does it mean to have this space that's like, it's a domestic space, but it's a space that is for play, where you go not to like sleep or unwind after work, but to like do the like energetic labor of like playing with your friends and your kind of community that you share this space with, as if it was your job, but your job that you love.
Right. And yeah, you're right. I didn't think about it that way. That it's reinforcing this idea for children. And certainly, again, I was a teenager when I watched it, how important play is. Yeah. You know, certainly for mental health and so on. Yeah. So look, it would be easy. And look, I'm a person that's like this. I'm somewhat cynical, certainly I think analytical or critical of these things, to think, even though I'm an ally, that I would, first reading your book, or I knew about your book. I know you are, but what am I? Wait a second. Who gets to decide what's queer coded? But the fact that you're able to say the people behind it actually acknowledge that these things that we're discussing here were built into the show, as part of their culture. I love that. That's fantastic. End of debate. Well,
and I think too, like, for me, coming back to write a book about the show now, I spent a lot of time doing archival research to see how queer people who were adults in the 1980s thought about the show, right? Because I had always understood it as this kind of like queer cult show. Like lots of my friends who are my age, like still love it, or like have Pee-wee Herman talking dolls, or like it has that kind of status the same way like John Waters films do, right? Mm-hmm. But I was a kid in the 80s, so I didn't know how this was received by queer adults at that time. But part of the research for the book, I went back and like read all these articles in gay and lesbian community newspapers and newsletters that were published at the time about the show, and really like enmeshed myself in like what was the fan culture amongst queer adults around Pee-wee's Playhouse in the late 80s and early 1990s. And it was huge, right? It was this like huge cultural touchstone. Like people would have watching parties of it. It was like, it was really like beloved by queer fans and audiences who were grown-ups watching this kids show on Saturdays. And that's a quite a wild thing. Like I can't think of another children's show that has aired in my lifetime that has been big in that way with queer grown-ups.
Hey, I know it sounds like we've got some giant corporate sponsor behind us, but we don't. Instead, our show is brought to you every week by listeners just like you. And by brought to you by them, I mean they help pay for the bills, and there's a bunch of them, to bring you a quality podcast about 80s nostalgia and its continued impact today. Hey, to join this group of fantastic folks, please go to patreon.com/1980snow. And if you can't do that, follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and the podcast platform you're listening to right now. I'm curious, at what point do you realize, you say when you're a kid and you're sort of seeing it, I don't know that maybe I don't even know how you felt about yourself and your own identity, that you would necessarily know that it aligned, as far as with the queer community, or the show rather, in that way. At what point in your life do you realize, wait a second, is it some, like you're saying, from other folks you hear it or you read something, or is this an epiphany thinking back on this show?
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a little bit, the answer to this question is kind of a little bit sad, actually. And it's a story that I'll tell you about me, but that I've heard from many other queer folks my age since I put this book out, have been like, that part of the story really resonated for me. But like, I knew I was different when I was 6, 7, 8, 9 watching this show. I knew that I liked girls. Like I didn't have names or categories or containers for those things at that age. Right. But I knew it was different. I didn't know that Pee-wee Herman was, this gay cultural icon, I knew that the character was a sissy, and that was something that people in my schoolyard called gay. Right. But then when Paul Rubens was arrested for masturbating in a adult movie theater or porn theater in the early 1990s and 1991, this was like a huge sex scandal that made its way to my schoolyard and many people's schoolyards. And I remember like quite vividly that my peers at school were calling him names, and they were calling him a pervert. They were calling him gay. They were calling him the F word that I won't say on this podcast. And that was the moment for me when it clicked. Like, oh, he is different, and they hate him, or are sort of violently trying to contain his behavior in the same way that I feel like that's happening to me, or starting to happen to me. And so it was this really like intense moment of like recognizing the thing that I was through the ways that Paul Rubens was being quite violently like othered and shamed in the fallout from this arrest. And it was also like a really galvanizing moment for queer adult fans of the show at that time, where people like used Paul Rubens being arrested in this porn theater as a moment to push back against the kind of AIDS phobic crackdown that had been happening on gay culture, on gay public sex cultures. And so I didn't know that at the time. I was a kid, but getting to return to the archives and see how important this moment was as a kind of opportunity to push back was also like quite powerful for me to get to see that history now.
It's interesting. I mean, it's wonderful and fascinating that you wouldn't have, because you were a younger person at the time, fall for this, the media line that, he was a deviant, that they were conflating sexuality with sexual deviance, or because he was a children's show host, must be a pedophile. That's what he did, right? That you saw it for, an extension of his character in a way, right? That he was that other, that he was, and just like you would protect Pee-wee, you'd protect Paul. And that's really fascinating that you'd, see it that way. When so many people didn't. And
yeah, I mean, I don't think I didn't understand what he had done. I just understood that he had done something bad. And I knew that I felt like that wasn't fair because I loved him so much. Mm. And it was like in my, and I became a teenager. I didn't think about Pee-wee's Playhouse. Other media became popular and whatever, it was in the past. But then I remember in my early 20s at some point kind of returning to this show. And it's like campiness, and like realizing what had actually happened to Paul Rubens, and kind of it clicking like how unjust that was, and what a kind of deliberately stigmatizing smear campaign the mainstream media mounted against him, and just feeling really angry and sad about that. And I think in a lot of ways, this is like, it's a fun book because it's about this really incredible and wild children's television show, but it's also a sad book because it deals a lot with Paul Rubens' arrest and what that meant and means for the ways that we think about sexuality.
Right. Yeah. Gosh. Yeah. I remember at the time, just like I was mentioning earlier about why can't people just mind their own damn business, that an adult person couldn't go into an adult theater and do adult things. Who are you? Not hurting anybody. I mean, it's just mystifying to me.
It's like what the theater exists for.
It's like, you go to a gas station, put gas in your car. Sir, I'd like to speak with you. I'm Detective so-and-so. I'm here to get gas.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's another interesting point about the 1980s too, right? Like porn theaters in the 1970s were these actually like pretty accepted spaces. Like straight people would go on dates to porn theaters. Like, Jack Nicholson took a bunch of dates to porn theaters in the 70s, and it was like reported on. It wasn't like this big kind of like pearl clutching thing. Right. But by the 1980s, we see this conservative backlash and these kind of spaces of public sex and sexuality get framed as really deviant, and like municipalities and state governments want to crack down on them and shut them down. And that's what Rubens gets caught up in here, right? And it's also specifically in the context of queer porn theaters about response to HIV/AIDS, right? Where they're shutting these spaces down as a public health measure, even though the kind of sex that happens in these theaters is not spreading HIV. It's like very low risk. It's mostly like solo sex. Yeah. So it's actually like a really safe place for men to go instead of places like bathhouses.
Yeah. Now, I guess because folks may be wondering, Paul Reubens himself never came out as queer. Is that correct?
No, never.
Of course, everything we're discussing here, especially with the show, shows he was certainly comfortable with that community. And, I don't know that he learned definitively otherwise or not, but certainly as an icon, I was going to use Cassandra Peterson as an example, but she came out in the last couple of years, so that's not a good example. That certainly we have folks that don't necessarily have to be out and still stand for the things that the queer community does and be these icons.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's worth kind of pausing on for a minute, right? Because that's something that I thought about a lot when I was writing this book. Is like Paul Reubens wasn't public about his sexuality. I think it's something that people in fan cultures like know and talk about. It's something that people in Hollywood seem to know and talk about, but he wasn't like this kind of out public figure. And part of what I thought about was like, how does that change what I'm writing here? And it kind of didn't, because the book was about how queer fans and queer folks took up Pee-wee Herman and Paul Reubens as these kind of icons and role models. So the sort of nitty gritty and the details of his private sexuality and sex life aren't relevant or important. He became this figure and this icon for queer culture. And I think he was quite happy to be that and to have that sort of fan world explode around him.
Right. And certainly, I guess, to your point, there's certainly plenty of heterosexual folks who are queer icons, because their values and what they stand for or fighting for queer community, queer people. Now, thank goodness, because I love Pee-wee. Paul Reubens, I'm so sad that he passed away a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. But before that, thank goodness he was welcomed back, invited back really into the zeitgeist by the mainstream. Like you said, his fans, their love of him never wavered. Certainly my interest and love of him and his character never changed. Was it just a matter of time that had passed that folks, he was welcomed back?
Yeah, I think time passed, and also like sexual values change. And it really doesn't, I think, seem to most people like a big deal to be arrested in an adult movie theater in, the 2010s in the way that it did in the early 1990s. Like the early 1990s was this period of really intense focus on celebrity sex scandal. Celebrities do things that are so much wilder in terms of their sexualities being exposed in public and in gossip magazines and culture today, right? So it just sort of became this smaller thing. And he also he made light of it and made jokes about it. And I think that sort of diffused in his appearances, and that sort of diffused the scandal over time. And he's beloved. He was an incredible comedian and an incredible actor. And I think as he started to have roles in Hollywood again, people really recognized that and wanted to see him. His career was never at the scale or scope again that it was when he was doing this show, right? It was the most popular children's television show for that entire time period. Oh, yeah. And one of the most popular television shows of all time. He never kind of rose to that level of fame and celebrity again. But, there was a new Pee-wee film for Netflix 4 or 5 years ago. It's quite good. It stars him and Joe Manganiello as his kind of love interest. I think it's called Pee-wee's Big. It's called Pee-wee's Big Holiday.
Yeah, right. And it was a holiday.
It's cute.
Theme, yeah, mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's good. He's very funny in it. They digitally de-age him.
Yeah,
Reubens, because I think, and that was part of his negotiation to do the film was Pee-wee has to appear a little bit young, or certainly younger than he was at the time he did that role. And he was had just started a stage show, like a new live theater performance as Pee-wee when COVID lockdown started. And then he, got sick after that. So that was sort of the last that we heard from him publicly. But there's also a new HBO documentary that's coming out about Paul Rubens, I believe, next year, that should give us a kind of in-depth look behind the scenes of his whole career, which I know lots of fans are looking forward to.
You mentioned that movie, and it makes me think of, now I'm thinking of everything through your lens, and this idea that in that film itself, now we could say it was queer-coded because of his we'd say is a bromance with Joe, I can't ever say his last name,
Me either, it's hard to say.
Mangiello?
The big hot guy from the Magic Mike movies who's not Channing Tatum.
Right. He was smaller and less hot in Spider-Man. That's what straight guys say to their wives when they lust over him. But yeah, they have that like romantic scene. But the thing about it is, I love how, again, whether it's we'll say it's queer coded, but these themes are ones that should just be generally accepted. This idea that I can love a man and I could just be I could be a heterosexual man and have a deep, passionate love for another man. And that's fine too.
Well, that's the work that a show like Pee-wee's Playhouse or like that newer Pee-wee film, that's the work that it does, right? Yeah. Like the cultural work that it does is it tries to pry open these ideas that we have about what masculinity is, to create more space for expression, not just of queer people, but for everyone, right? So that masculinity can be less of a prison, for lack of a better word, for all men, right? Mm-hmm. So that you can do things like express your feelings for your guy friends and not feel embarrassed or hesitant to do so, right? Because that's a much more joyful way of getting to like live in your gender.
Yeah.
Like I'm always struck. I'm a teacher. I teach in university, so I'm teaching, people of many gendered experiences and expressions, and I'm always so struck still by like how hard it is in the year of our Lord 2024 for some of my straight cis male students to be able to express their feelings, and they want to be able to do it, right? They want to be able to do it. And so we really need still these like alternative representations of masculinity and ways of occupying masculinity in our popular media in order to keep trying to like pry that open, especially because like we are living in a moment of really, again, intense, like normative gender getting thrust back on us in these really strict ways, especially on young people.
Yeah. Gosh, yeah, it makes me sad. You're talking about how you think with time we just get more progressive in theory, and we do, but there's also these 2 steps back. I just always think like, my hope for my generation, because I feel like we became more open and accepting for these types of things, that our children would be too. But there's still plenty of Gen Xers and younger and older that teach their kids to, hate and discriminate, and things have to be one way and not the other. And oh my goodness, it's just a big disappointment.
Yeah. And it's fear, right? People are afraid of difference.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a look, I am friends with folks who don't share all of my beliefs and philosophies. And I try to maintain those friendships because, for example, I had a friend of mine who does it, who is homophobic. And I said to him, you know what? Do you know any gay people? No. I said, all right, well then, we got to work on that. And maybe that's the way to get through to you, I don't know, do we have a Pee-wee Herman nowadays? We have probably scattered, sort of role models in this sense that we're talking about. But I don't know that we have a Pee-wee. I don't know that we'll have a Pee-wee in that way.
Yeah, I get asked that question pretty often talking about the book, is like, what is the today version of this kids show? And I agree with you. I don't think that there is one. It was like so of its time. And it's interesting watching it with like little kids now, right? Because like it's so unlike anything they're used to seeing, and they like get it, but are also like, what is happening here?
Yeah. You remind me in the book of how manic the show was. It's just so charged up, fired out of a cannon, and just the whole way. It's like on the gas the whole way.
Yeah, it's like watching a YouTube video on 1.5 speed. That's what it feels like now.
Yeah. All right, Cait, I'm going to leave it there. Sadly, I feel like I'm leaving it on a down note. Our world is screwed. There's no Pee-wee Herman to save us.
It's on YouTube. You can find it there.
Yeah, and hey, look, Cait's book does a much better job of how I can sort of, and there's so much more detail in here. Check out I Know What You Are, But What Am I on Pee-wee Herman by Cait McKinney. Thanks so much for your time, Cait.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
As I mentioned before the interview, the character of Pee-wee Herman truly made me feel empowered to behave more like myself, more how I wanted to be, that it was okay to be exactly who I was. Now, we are most only aware of our own experiences, even for folks who are empathetic. You can't really know what's going on with other folks. So how wonderful to find out how even more special, important the character, the show, the actor was to folks of the queer community. And along those lines, as I mentioned at the beginning, it makes me sad that a guy who, I was sad when he passed anyway. It's the only time I ever posted about someone passing on our social media. Because otherwise it's a bummer, honestly. We've got so many of the folks that we love, that we watched on TV or music we listened to growing up that it just really bums me out. You know, we're getting at that age now, folks. It's unfortunate. But when Paul Reubens died, this was the only time I mentioned that someone had passed. And of course, having read Cait's book and did on my own self-examination, I realized how important it was. Not only did I love this character, but it was important to me. Which, again, just makes me sad that he wasn't, even though he inspired folks to live their lives more fully, more truthfully, he didn't do so himself. So back to this People article magazine, which I mentioned, in which they explain how Paul Reubens came out as gay in a posthumous documentary that premiered at Sundance just a few days ago. And I imagine will be available for the rest of us to see real soon. But it goes on to say that before Reubens became known for playing Pee-wee, he revealed he was in a relationship with a man named Guy from Echo Park, Los Angeles. In fact, some of Guy's vocal tics inspired some of Pee-wee's most iconic catchphrases. And in 1981, Reubens debuted the childlike character that of course, Pee-wee Herman, as I mentioned, but first as a member of the Groundlings comedy troupe. And soon after this, his career took off. But along with that, this celebrity, fame, the actor made the decision to keep any details surrounding his private life under lock. Quote, "I was out of the closet and then I went back in the closet. I wasn't pursuing the Paul Reubens career. I was pursuing the Pee-wee Herman career." End quote. The last time Reubens saw Guy, he was visiting him in the hospital as he was dying of AIDS. Oh boy. Quote, "To talk about seeing someone at death's door, he probably died a couple hours after that." End quote. Gosh, he was a fixture on TV throughout the 1980s. In addition to having his own television show, in addition to having his own films, he was a regular on late night talk shows. Early in the 1980s, you'd see him do some cameos in some films like Cheech and Chong, and so on and so forth. Anyway, he is loved. He is missed. But the good news, I suppose, I don't suppose, the good news, as we discussed with Cait and as they discuss in their book, and you should get a copy of I Know What You Are, But What Am I? Reubens' legacy continues to influence us today. All right. Hey, on behalf of me and my co-hosts, Kat and John, who will join me on our next regular episode, we will talk to you next time on 1980s Now.